The new girl. Sarah Chen walked through the main gate of Naval Base Norfolk at exactly 700 hours on a Monday morning in September. The Virginia sun was already warm, casting long shadows across the concrete pathways that stretched between massive gray buildings. She carried a simple black duffel bag over her shoulder and wore civilian clothes. Dark jeans, a navy blue polo shirt, and comfortable walking shoes. To anyone watching, she looked like just another new civilian employee reporting for her first day of work. The base was already bustling with activity. Sailors in their crisp white uniforms hurried between buildings, their polished shoes clicking against the pavement. Military vehicles rumbled past, carrying supplies and personnel to various locations around the sprawling facility. The smell of salt air mixed with diesel fuel and fresh paint, creating the distinctive scent that every naval base seemed to share. Sarah stopped at the visitors center to check in. The young petty officer behind the desk barely looked up from his computer screen as he processed her temporary identification badge. "Ma'am, you'll need to report to Building 47 for orientation," he said, sliding the plastic badge across the counter. "Personnel office is on the second floor." "Thank you," Sarah replied politely, clipping the badge to her shirt. She noticed how the sailor's eyes didn't quite meet hers, as if she were invisible or unimportant. It was a reaction she had grown accustomed to over the years. Building 47 stood like a concrete fortress in the heart of the base. Its windows were small and practical, designed more for function than aesthetics. Sarah climbed the stairs to the second floor, her footsteps echoing in the sterile hallway. The walls were painted in that particular shade of government beige that seemed to exist nowhere else in the world. The personnel office was a maze of cubicles and filing cabinets. Several civilian employees sat at their desks, typing on computers or shuffling through paperwork. Most were middle-aged women who had worked on the base for decades. They looked up when Sarah entered, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to outright skepticism. "Can we help you?" asked a woman with graying hair and thick glasses. Her name tag read, "Margaret Frost, Supervisor." "I'm Sarah Chen. I'm here for orientation as the new administrative coordinator," Sarah said, approaching the desk with a friendly smile. Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly. "Administrative coordinator? I wasn't aware we were hiring for that position." She turned to her computer, clicking through several screens. "I don't see any orders for a new coordinator." "Perhaps there's been some confusion," Sarah said calmly. "I was told to report here this morning." Another woman, younger but with a harder expression, spoke up from a nearby cubicle. "Are you sure you're in the right place? Maybe you're looking for the commissary or the exchange. They hire a lot of—" She paused, looking Sarah up and down. "Temporary workers." Sarah recognized the tone immediately. It wasn't the first time someone had made assumptions about her capabilities based on her appearance. She was petite, standing barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with a youthful face that made her look younger than her actual age. Her Asian heritage often led people to categorize her in ways that had nothing to do with her qualifications or experience. "I'm quite certain I'm in the right place," Sarah replied evenly. "Perhaps you could check with your supervisor about the new position." Margaret made a show of picking up her phone and dialing an extension. "Commander Williams?" "Yes, sir. We have a young lady here claiming to be a new administrative coordinator." "I see. Yes, sir." She hung up and looked at Sarah with barely concealed surprise. "Commander Williams will see you in his office. Down the hall, third door on the right." Sarah thanked her and walked down the corridor, aware that several pairs of eyes were watching her every move. She could hear whispered conversations starting behind her, but she kept her focus straight ahead. Commander Williams was a tall, thin man in his 50s, with prematurely gray hair and tired eyes. His office was sparse, decorated only with a few naval commendations and a photo of his family. He stood when Sarah entered, extending his hand in greeting. "Ms. Chen, welcome to Norfolk. Please, have a seat." His tone was professional but cautious. "I have to admit I wasn't expecting you quite so soon. The paperwork from headquarters only arrived Friday afternoon." "I understand there might be some confusion about my role here," Sarah said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "I'm happy to clarify anything you need to know." Commander Williams opened a manila folder on his desk. "According to these orders, you're here as part of a new efficiency initiative. Something about streamlining administrative processes across multiple departments." He looked up at her with a puzzled expression. "But I have to ask, what kind of experience do you have with military operations? This is a pretty specialized environment." Sarah had fielded this question countless times throughout her career. "I have extensive experience working with large organizations and complex bureaucratic systems. I'm confident I can adapt quickly to the unique requirements of a naval facility." "Well," Commander Williams said, closing the folder, "I suppose we'll see how it goes. For now, you'll be working primarily with the Supply Chain Coordination Department. Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez will show you around and get you set up with the necessary access credentials." 20 minutes later, Sarah found herself following Chief Rodriguez through a maze of corridors and stairwells. He was a stocky man with calloused hands and a no-nonsense attitude that she immediately respected. "So you're the new efficiency expert," he said as they walked. "Got to be honest with you. We've seen a lot of consultants and coordinators come through here over the years. Most of them last about 6 weeks before they realize military logistics isn't like running a civilian business." "I appreciate the honesty," Sarah replied. "What would you say are the biggest challenges the department faces?" Rodriguez stopped at a security door and swiped his access card. "Time and resources, mostly. We're always being asked to do more with less. Equipment requests take forever to process, supply chains get disrupted, and everyone wants their stuff yesterday." He held the door open for her. "Plus, there's a lot of politics involved that outsiders don't always understand." They entered a large open area filled with desks, computer terminals, and filing cabinets. About 20 people worked at various stations, most of them in uniform. The noise level was considerable. Phones ringing, printers humming, and conversations overlapping as personnel coordinated shipments and requisitions. "Hey, everyone," Rodriguez called out, his voice cutting through the noise. "We've got a new team member. This is Sarah Chen, our new administrative coordinator." The response was mixed. A few people looked up and nodded politely, while others barely acknowledged her presence. Sarah noticed several exchange glances and raised eyebrows, the kind of silent communication that happens in any workplace when something unexpected occurs. A young sailor approached them. "Chief, we've got a problem with the Johnson requisition. The vendor says they never received our purchase order, but our system shows it was sent 3 weeks ago." "Again?" Rodriguez sighed. "That's the 4th time this month." He turned to Sarah. "This is exactly what I was talking about. Somewhere between our system and theirs, paperwork just disappears into thin air." Sarah listened carefully as Rodriguez and the sailor discussed the problem. She asked a few questions about their process, taking mental notes about potential inefficiencies she observed. Already, she could see several areas where improvements might be possible. "I'll set you up at that desk over there," Rodriguez said, pointing to an empty workstation near the far wall. "Computer should be ready to go, but you'll need to wait for IT to set up your accounts. Could take a day or two." As Sarah walked over to her assigned desk, she overheard fragments of conversations from the people around her. "Who is she again?" "Some kind of consultant, I think." "Great. Another person telling us how to do our jobs." "She looks like she's about 12 years old." Sarah arranged her few personal items on the desk and sat down in the standard issue office chair. The computer monitor displayed a login screen that she couldn't access yet. She pulled out a notebook and began observing the flow of activity around her, documenting the patterns she noticed. At lunchtime, she walked to the base cafeteria alone. The dining facility was enormous, capable of serving hundreds of people simultaneously. She selected a simple sandwich and found an empty table near the windows. As she ate, she watched the constant stream of military personnel and civilian workers coming and going. "Mind if I sit here?" Sarah looked up to see a woman about her own age wearing a lieutenant's uniform. She had short brown hair and an open, friendly face. "Please, go ahead," Sarah said, gesturing to the empty chairs. "I'm Jessica Martinez," the lieutenant said, sitting down with her tray. "I work in communications. You must be the new person everyone's talking about." "Word travels fast around here," Sarah observed with a smile. "Small base, big gossip network?" Jessica laughed. "So what's your story? What brings you to our little corner of the Navy?" Sarah appreciated the straightforward question. "I'm here to help improve some administrative processes. Hopefully make everyone's job a little easier." "Well, that would be a welcome change," Jessica said. "Sometimes I feel like we spend more time fighting our own systems than doing actual work." She paused, studying Sarah's face. "Can I ask you something? And please don't take this the wrong way, but you seem really calm about all this. Most civilians who come to work on base are pretty overwhelmed at first." Sarah considered her answer carefully. "I suppose I've learned to adapt to new environments pretty quickly. Every organization has its own culture and way of doing things." They talked for the rest of lunch about various aspects of base life. Jessica was clearly well-respected and well-connected, and Sarah found her insights valuable. When they parted ways, Jessica offered to show her around some of the other departments later in the week. The afternoon brought a series of small challenges. Sarah's computer access was delayed, so she spent time reviewing procedure manuals and organizational charts. Several people approached her desk with questions she couldn't answer yet, and she politely directed them to Chief Rodriguez or other supervisors. Around 4 o'clock, she witnessed her first real crisis. A urgent supply request had been misrouted, delaying critical equipment that a ship needed before departing the next morning. The mistake had originated somewhere in the paper trail, but no one could figure out exactly where. "This is a disaster," muttered one of the senior petty officers. "Captain's going to have our heads if that ship sails without proper communications equipment." Sarah listened to the discussion, noting the various checkpoints and approval processes involved. After about 10 minutes, she quietly approached Chief Rodriguez. "Excuse me, Chief. I might have noticed something that could help." Rodriguez looked skeptical, but gestured for her to continue. "Looking at the paperwork flow, it seems like there are several points where requests can get stuck, if even one person is out sick or busy with other duties." "What if there was a backup verification system?" "What kind of backup system?" Sarah quickly sketched out a simple flow chart showing how requests could be automatically flagged and rerouted if they sat in any single queue for too long. It was a basic concept, but it addressed the specific problem they were facing. Rodriguez studied the diagram for a moment. "That's actually not a bad idea. Pretty simple, too." He showed it to the petty officer who had been dealing with the crisis. "What do you think, Patterson?" "Could work," Patterson admitted grudgingly. "At least it would prevent stuff from just sitting on someone's desk for days." By the end of the day, they had managed to expedite the delayed equipment request, using a modified version of Sarah's suggestion. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it solved the immediate problem and gave everyone something to think about for future improvements. As she prepared to leave, Chief Rodriguez approached her desk. "Not bad for a first day," he said. "You might actually be useful around here." Sarah smiled as she packed up her notebook. "I hope so, Chief. See you tomorrow." Walking back to the main gate, she reflected on the day's events. The skepticism and initial resistance were exactly what she had expected. People were naturally protective of their established routines and suspicious of outsiders who claimed they could make things better. What they didn't know, what none of them could know, was that Sarah Chen had been dealing with complex organizational challenges and skeptical colleagues for most of her adult life. She had learned long ago that the best way to earn respect was through consistent performance and quiet competence. As she showed her temporary badge to the gate guard and walked to her car, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but today had been a good start. The real work was just beginning, and she had no intention of letting anyone down. The sun was setting over the Chesapeake Bay, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Somewhere in the distance, a ship's horn sounded, a deep note that carried across the water. It was the sound of the Navy going about its business, the same as it had for generations. Soon enough, everyone on the base would understand exactly who Sarah Chen was and why she was really there. But for now, she was content to be underestimated. It made the job so much easier. The challenge. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah Chen's first day at Naval Base Norfolk, and she had settled into a routine that surprised everyone around her. While most civilian consultants struggled to understand even basic military terminology, Sarah seemed to absorb information like a sponge. She arrived early, stayed late, and asked thoughtful questions that revealed a deeper understanding of naval operations than anyone expected. The Supply Chain Coordination Department had gradually warmed up to her presence. Her suggestions were practical and implementable, and she never made anyone feel foolish for their current methods. Instead, she presented improvements as natural evolutions of existing processes. Chief Rodriguez had become her strongest ally. "You know," he told his wife over dinner one evening, "this Chen lady actually gets it. She doesn't try to reinvent everything from scratch. She just makes what we're already doing work better." But not everyone shared his enthusiasm. Lieutenant Commander Bradley Harrison had been watching Sarah's progress with growing irritation. As the base's deputy operations officer, he oversaw several departments, including supply chain coordination. Harrison was a career officer with 15 years of service, and he took pride in running a tight ship. He had been expecting to be promoted to full commander within the year, and he didn't appreciate having his authority questioned by a civilian contractor. Harrison was an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with a commanding voice and the kind of presence that made junior officers straighten their posture when he entered a room. He wore his uniform with military precision, every ribbon and insignia perfectly placed. His corner office was arranged to reinforce his status, with his desk positioned so that visitors had to look up at him when seated. On a Thursday morning in October, Harrison decided it was time to put the new administrative coordinator in her place. Sarah was reviewing quarterly efficiency reports when Harrison appeared at her desk. The busy department seemed to quiet down as people sensed the tension in the air. "Ms. Chen," Harrison said, his voice carrying across the room, "I need to see you in conference room B. Now." Sarah looked up from her computer screen. "Of course, Lieutenant Commander." "Should I bring anything specific?" "Just yourself," Harrison replied curtly, then turned and walked toward the conference room without waiting for her to follow. Conference Room B was a windowless space with a large rectangular table and uncomfortable chairs. Harrison took a seat at the head of the table and gestured for Sarah to sit across from him. The positioning was deliberate. He wanted her to feel small and intimidated. "I've been reviewing your work over the past few weeks," Harrison began, opening a thick folder, "and I have some serious concerns about your methodology and recommendations." Sarah folded her hands on the table and waited for him to continue. She had learned that the best response to aggressive authority figures was calm attention. "This flowchart you created for expediting supply requests," Harrison said, pulling out a copy of Sarah's diagram. "It completely bypasses established chain of command protocols. Do you understand that these procedures exist for important reasons?" "I understand that protocols serve important functions," Sarah replied carefully. "My suggestion was designed to maintain all existing approval requirements while reducing processing time for urgent requests." "Your suggestion undermines military discipline," Harrison snapped. When junior personnel think they can skip levels of approval, it creates chaos. We can't have every petty officer deciding what constitutes an emergency. Sarah studied his face, noting the flush of anger in his cheeks. The flowchart doesn't change who makes approval decisions. It simply creates automatic alerts when requests sit idle for more than 48 hours. All the same, people still review and approve every request. That's not the point, Harrison said, his voice rising. The point is that you're a civilian contractor with no military experience, and you're attempting to redesign systems that have worked for decades. Who do you think you are to come in here and tell us how to do our jobs? The question hung in the air between them. Sarah recognized it as a pivotal moment. She could respond defensively, apologetically, or diplomatically. But something in Harrison's tone suggested that he wasn't really interested in her methodology or her suggestions. This was about power, territory, and the threat that her presence represented to his authority. "I'm someone who was brought here to identify opportunities for improvement," Sarah said quietly. "I'm not trying to replace anyone or undermine any authority. I'm simply offering tools that might make everyone's job easier." Harrison leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Let me be very clear about something, Ms. Chen. This is a military installation, not some civilian corporation. We have traditions, standards, and a way of doing things that has been proven in combat. I won't have some young consultant with no military background coming in here and disrupting my departments." "I understand your concerns," Sarah replied. "Perhaps we could discuss specific aspects of the recommendations that worry you." "What worries me is that you don't seem to grasp the scope of your limitations," Harrison said. He stood up and began pacing behind his chair. "Tell me, Ms. Chen, what exactly qualifies you to advise a naval base on operational efficiency? What's your background? Where did you work before this?" Sarah hesitated for just a moment. The question was reasonable, but she recognized the trap. Anything she said about her background would either sound inadequate to Harrison or reveal more than she was ready to share. "I have extensive experience working with large organizations and complex operational systems," she said. "I specialize in identifying bottlenecks and streamlining processes." "That's very vague," Harrison pressed. "What organizations? What kind of experience? Surely someone making recommendations about naval operations should have some relevant credentials." Before Sarah could respond, the conference room door opened. Chief Rodriguez stepped inside, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Excuse me, Lieutenant Commander, sorry to interrupt, but we have a situation that requires immediate attention." Harrison turned toward Rodriguez with obvious irritation. "Chief, I'm in the middle of an important meeting. Can't this wait?" "Sir, we just received an emergency equipment request from the USS Hampton. They're due to deploy in 18 hours, and their communication system failed during pre-deployment testing. They need replacement components immediately or they'll miss their deployment window." Harrison's jaw tightened. Missing deployment schedules was exactly the kind of problem that could derail an officer's career. "How did this happen? Why wasn't the equipment tested earlier?" "It was tested, sir. The system passed all initial checks, but something failed during the final stress test this morning. The ship's technical crew thinks it might be a cascading failure. When one component goes bad, it takes others with it." Sarah listened to the exchange with growing understanding. This was exactly the kind of crisis that her improved procedures were designed to prevent. But pointing that out right now would only make Harrison more defensive. "What kind of components do they need?" Harrison asked. Rodriguez consulted his notes. "Primary communication relay modules, backup power supplies, and interface cables. Standard stuff, but the specific models need to match their existing system architecture. How long will it take to source and deliver?" "That's the problem, sir. Using normal procurement procedures, we're looking at minimum 72 hours. Even if we expedite everything, it's going to be tight." Harrison ran his hand through his hair, clearly calculating the implications. A delayed deployment would reflect poorly on everyone involved, from the ship's captain to the base operations staff. It was the kind of crisis that could cascade into multiple career problems. Sarah cleared her throat softly. "Excuse me, Lieutenant Commander. If I might make a suggestion?" Harrison whirled around to face her, his face flushed with frustration. "Ms. Chen, this is exactly what I was talking about. This is a military operation requiring immediate action, not a time for theoretical discussions about process improvement." "I understand the urgency," Sarah said calmly, "but there might be a way to get the components they need within 12 hours instead of 72. Both Harrison and Rodriguez stared at her. "How?" Rodriguez asked. "The Norfolk Navy shipyard has an extensive inventory of communication equipment for emergency repairs. If we can establish that this qualifies as an operational emergency, they might be able to provide the components directly instead of waiting for regular procurement channels." Harrison scoffed. "The shipyard doesn't just hand out equipment to anyone who asks. There are procedures, authorizations, documentation requirements." "Absolutely," Sarah agreed. "But there's also Emergency Supply Protocol 7 Alpha, which allows for immediate equipment transfer between naval facilities when operational readiness is at stake. The paperwork can be processed retroactively as long as the commanding officer certifies the emergency status." Rodriguez looked impressed. "I didn't know about that protocol." "It's rarely used," Sarah said, "but it exists specifically for situations like this." Harrison studied her with new wariness. "How do you know about Protocol 7 Alpha?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "It's part of the administrative procedures I've been reviewing. I like to understand all available options before making recommendations." For a moment, Harrison seemed torn between his dislike of Sarah and his need to solve the immediate crisis. Professional necessity won out. "Chief, contact the shipyard and see if Protocol 7 Alpha applies to this situation. If it does, initiate the emergency transfer request immediately." "Yes, sir," Rodriguez replied, already reaching for his radio. As Rodriguez left to handle the emergency, Harrison turned back to Sarah. His expression was a mixture of grudging respect and increased suspicion. "That was useful information," he admitted reluctantly. "But it doesn't change my fundamental concerns about your role here." "I understand," Sarah said. "Perhaps we could continue this discussion after the current crisis is resolved?" Harrison nodded curtly. "We'll definitely be continuing this discussion, Ms. Chen. I want to know exactly how a civilian contractor happens to know obscure naval protocols that some of my own officers haven't heard of." As they left the conference room, Sarah realized that her small victory had come at a cost. She had solved an immediate problem, but she had also raised questions that she wasn't ready to answer. Harrison was no longer just skeptical of her methods. He was actively suspicious of her background and knowledge. Over the next few days, word of the emergency supply success spread throughout the department. The USS Hampton had received their equipment in time and deployed on schedule. Sarah found herself being consulted more frequently on procedural questions, and her suggestions carried more weight. But Harrison's scrutiny intensified. He began asking pointed questions about her previous work, requesting detailed explanations for her recommendations, and challenging her knowledge of military procedures. It became clear that he was building a case to have her removed from the base. The situation came to a head the following week when Harrison requested a formal review of Sarah's performance and credentials. He submitted a report to the base commander questioning her qualifications and recommending that her contract be terminated. "She claims to have experience with large organizations," Harrison wrote in his report, "but she refuses to provide specific details about her background. Her knowledge of military procedures is suspiciously detailed for someone who claims to be a civilian contractor. I recommend a thorough background investigation before allowing her continued access to sensitive operational information." The report was forwarded to Captain James Morrison, the base commanding officer, who found himself in an interesting position. Morrison was a practical man who cared more about results than politics. His departments had been struggling with efficiency problems for years, and the improvements he was seeing since Sarah's arrival were exactly what he had been hoping for. But Harrison's concerns were not unreasonable. Security was paramount on any military installation, and unusual knowledge or behavior needed to be investigated. Morrison decided to call a meeting with all parties involved. "Gentlemen and Ms. Chen," Morrison said as the group assembled in his office, "we need to clear the air about a few things. Lieutenant Commander Harrison has raised some valid questions about operational procedures and personnel qualifications. I'd like to address these concerns directly." Harrison sat up straighter, clearly expecting validation of his position. "Sir, my concerns focus on ensuring that sensitive operational information is only shared with properly vetted personnel." "I understand," Morrison replied. "Ms. Chen, Lieutenant Commander Harrison has questioned your knowledge of certain military protocols. Specifically, how did you become familiar with Emergency Supply Protocol 7 Alpha? Sarah looked around the room at the faces watching her. Chief Rodriguez appeared supportive but curious. Harrison looked triumphant, as if he had already won some sort of victory. Morrison seemed genuinely interested in her answer. She realized that this moment would define not just her remaining time at the base, but potentially the success or failure of her entire mission. The time for vague answers and careful deflection was ending. "Captain Morrison," she said carefully, "I became familiar with that protocol because understanding emergency procedures is essential to my work here. When you're trying to improve administrative efficiency, you need to understand all the tools available to the people you're trying to help." "That's a reasonable answer," Morrison said. "But it doesn't fully address the Lieutenant Commander's concerns about your background and qualifications." Harrison leaned forward. "Sir, with respect, I think we deserve more specific information about Ms. Chen's previous experience. What organizations has she worked with? What kind of clearance does she hold? How did she learn so much about naval procedures so quickly?" Morrison nodded slowly. "Those are fair questions." He turned to Sarah. "Ms. Chen, I'm going to ask you directly. Is there anything about your background or qualifications that we should know? Anything that would explain your familiarity with military procedures and your ability to identify solutions so quickly?" Sarah felt the weight of the moment. Around her, careers hung in the balance. Her own, certainly, but also Harrison's ambitions and Morrison's command effectiveness. The wrong answer could unravel everything she had worked to build. But she also sensed that the time for half-truths was over. These people deserved honesty, even if she couldn't tell them everything. "Captain," she said slowly, "I think there may have been some miscommunication about my role here." The revelation. Captain Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying Sarah's face with the kind of intense attention that came from years of evaluating personnel under pressure. The silence in his office stretched for several seconds, broken only by the distant sound of aircraft taking off from the nearby airfield. "What kind of miscommunication?" Morrison asked finally. Sarah chose her words carefully. "I believe there may have been some confusion about the nature of my assignment here. Perhaps it would be helpful if you contacted Admiral Patricia Hawkins at Naval Personnel Command to clarify my exact role and authorization." The reaction in the room was immediate. Lieutenant Commander Harrison straightened in his chair, his confident expression replaced by uncertainty. Chief Rodriguez's eyebrows rose. Captain Morrison's demeanor shifted from casual inquiry to sharp professional attention. "Admiral Hawkins?" Morrison repeated. "You're suggesting that a 3-star admiral is personally involved with your assignment?" "I'm suggesting that Admiral Hawkins might be able to provide clarity about my mission here," Sarah replied evenly. Harrison's face flushed. Captain, this is exactly what I've been talking about. Miss Aber Chen consistently deflects questions about her background and now claims direct contact with flag-level officers. It's highly irregular. Morrison reached for his phone. There's one way to settle this. He dialed the number for Naval Personnel Command and asked to be connected to Admiral Hawkins's office. After a brief hold, he was transferred directly. Admiral Hawkins, this is Captain Morrison at Norfolk. I have a question about a civilian contractor named Sarah Chen, who's been assigned to my base. Yes, ma'am. I see. No, ma'am, we haven't. Yes, Admiral, she's sitting right here in my office. Morrison's expression changed dramatically during the phone call. His casual posture became more formal, and he began taking notes on a legal pad. Yes, Admiral, I understand completely. No excuses, ma'am. Immediately. Yes. Admiral. He hung up the phone and looked at Sarah with a mixture of respect and embarrassment. Ms. Chen, Admiral Hawkins has requested that I ask you to step outside for a moment while I speak with Lieutenant Commander Harrison and Chief Rodriguez. Sarah nodded and left the office, settling into a chair in the outer waiting area. Through the closed door, she could hear the captain's voice, though she couldn't make out specific words. The tone, however, was unmistakably serious. Inside the office, Captain Morrison faced his subordinates with a grim expression. Gentlemen, I'm going to share some information with you, and I want to be very clear about the sensitivity involved. What I'm about to tell you is not to leave this room under any circumstances. Both officers nodded. Sarah Chen is not a civilian contractor, Morrison said. She is Rear Admiral Sarah Chen, and she's here conducting a confidential operational assessment as part of a larger Navy initiative to improve efficiency across all installations. The silence that followed was profound. Harrison's face went from confusion to shock to what looked like nausea. Rodriguez just stared at the captain with his mouth slightly open. Sir, Harrison said weakly, are you saying that Ms. Chen is actually an admiral? That's exactly what I'm saying. Admiral Chen has been operating under administrative cover to observe our operations without the artificial improvements that typically occur when senior officers visit. She wanted to see how things actually work, not how we want them to appear to work. Harrison put his head in his hands. Oh, God. I've been challenging an admiral for 3 weeks. I demanded to know her qualifications. I tried to have her removed from the base. Yes, you did, Morrison said coldly. Admiral Hawkins was very interested to hear about your concerns regarding Admiral Chen's competency and background. Rodriguez found his voice. Sir, with respect, how were we supposed to know? She never said anything about being an officer, let alone an admiral. That was the point, Chief. This was an undercover assessment designed to identify systemic problems that might not be apparent during normal inspections. Morrison's tone softened slightly. The good news is that Admiral Chen's preliminary findings are quite positive regarding your department's efficiency and adaptability. Harrison looked up. What does this mean for us? For me? That depends entirely on Admiral Chen's final report and recommendations, Morrison replied. I suggest you think very carefully about how you've comported yourself over the past few weeks. Morrison called Sarah back into the office. As she entered, both Harrison and Rodriguez stood at attention, their entire demeanor transformed. Admiral Chen, Morrison said, please accept my apologies for any lack of proper protocol. We were not informed of your actual rank or mission. Sarah raised her hand. Please, continue as we were. The whole point of this assessment was to observe normal operations and interactions. Changing behavior now would defeat the purpose. But the change was unavoidable. Harrison's face was pale, and he seemed unable to make eye contact. Rodriguez looked stunned, but respectful. Admiral, Harrison said quietly, I owe you a significant apology. My behavior has been unprofessional and inappropriate. I had no right to question your methods or demand explanations of your background. Sarah studied his face, seeing genuine distress beyond just concern for his career. Lieutenant Commander, you are doing exactly what a good officer should do. Protecting your command and ensuring security protocols were followed. Your concerns were legitimate given the information you had. But the way I handled it was wrong, Harrison insisted. I was dismissive, condescending, and frankly hostile. There's no excuse for that kind of behavior toward anyone, regardless of rank. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. You raise an interesting point about behavior and respect. That's actually one of the key areas I've been evaluating. She moved to the whiteboard on Morrison's wall and began drawing a simple organizational chart. One of the patterns I've observed across multiple naval installations is how information flows differently depending on perceived authority. When people think they're dealing with junior personnel or civilians, they often reveal problems and inefficiencies they would never mention to senior officers. She added arrows and notes to her diagram. Your initial skepticism actually provided valuable insights into how personnel really view administrative changes. The fact that your department gradually accepted my suggestions based on merit rather than rank tells me that the underlying culture here is quite healthy. Harrison looked confused. So my behavior was useful? Your initial caution was appropriate, Sarah clarified. Your professional behavior toward someone you believed was a civilian contractor was less ideal, but your willingness to acknowledge problems and implement solutions when they proved effective, that tells me this command has good leadership and adaptable personnel. Captain Morrison leaned forward. Admiral Chen, what can you tell us about your assessment so far? Sarah returned to her seat, but her entire bearing had subtly shifted. The deferential posture was gone, replaced by the confident authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of people. Norfolk has some of the best operational efficiency metrics I've seen in recent evaluations, she said. Your personnel are innovative, adaptable, and focused on mission accomplishment. The Supply Chain Coordination Department has been particularly impressive. Chief Rodriguez beamed at the compliment, while Harrison still looked like he was processing the entire situation. However, Sarah continued, there are some systemic issues that need attention. Communication protocols between departments could be streamlined. Emergency procedures are effective, but not widely understood across all personnel levels. And there's room for improvement in how civilian contractors and temporary personnel are integrated into operational planning. She looked directly at Harrison. Some of these issues became apparent through our interactions over the past few weeks. Your concerns about proper authorization and chain of command were valid, but they also revealed gaps in how we prepare commands for special assignments and assessments. Morrison took notes as she spoke. What kind of timeline are we looking at for implementing changes? Most of the recommendations I'll be making can be implemented gradually without disrupting current operations, Sarah replied. The goal is to enhance what's already working rather than replace existing systems. Harrison finally seemed to find his footing. Admiral, if I may ask, how long have you been in the Navy? Your knowledge of procedures and protocols is incredibly comprehensive. For the first time since the revelation, Sarah smiled with genuine warmth. 18 years, Lieutenant Commander. I started as an ensign in Supply Corps, worked my way through various operational and administrative roles, and spent the last 5 years focusing on organizational efficiency across fleet commands. 18 years, Harrison repeated. You must have been commissioned very young. 22, Sarah confirmed. I know I look younger than my actual age, which has been both a challenge and occasionally an advantage throughout my career. The room fell quiet as everyone processed this information. Rodriguez was the first to speak. Admiral, ma'am, can I ask what happens now? Do we continue the assessment, or does everything change now that we know who you are? Sarah considered the question. Ideally, we would continue as we have been, but I recognize that's probably impossible given what's happened. The dynamic has fundamentally changed. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the base, bustling with afternoon activity. This is actually one of the challenges of conducting this kind of assessment. At some point, the cover becomes unsustainable, and you have to decide whether to reveal the truth or abort the mission. Turning back to the group, she continued, I think we've gathered enough observational data to complete a meaningful assessment. The question now is how we transition to a more traditional senior officer visit while maintaining the authenticity of what we've learned. Captain Morrison nodded. What do you recommend? I'd like to spend the remainder of this week completing my evaluation in my current role, then transition to a formal senior officer visit next week. That will allow me to document both the real operational picture and the command's response to traditional inspection protocols. That sounds reasonable, Morrison agreed. What about Lieutenant Commander Harrison's concerns regarding proper notification and authorization? Sarah looked at Harrison, who had been unusually quiet during this exchange. The Lieutenant Commander's concerns were completely valid. In retrospect, this command should have been given more information about my mission, even if my specific identity remained classified. That's feedback I'll be providing to Admiral Hawkins. Harrison straightened. Admiral, I need to ask directly. Have my actions over the past few weeks damaged my career prospects? The question hung in the air with obvious importance. Everyone in the room understood that Harrison's evaluation of his perceived civilian contractor could indeed have significant consequences for his future. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Lieutenant Commander, your actions revealed both strengths and areas for improvement. Your commitment to security and proper procedures was commendable. Your initial skepticism of proposed changes showed appropriate caution. Your willingness to implement effective solutions demonstrated good judgment and flexibility. She paused, choosing her words carefully. However, your interpersonal communication needs attention. Being cautious about new procedures is different from being dismissive of people. Protecting your authority is different from being condescending to personnel you perceive as junior or civilian. Harrison nodded soberly. I understand, ma'am. The good news, Sarah continued, is that these are correctable leadership issues, not fundamental character flaws. I've seen similar patterns in many promising officers who simply need more experience working with diverse teams and complex command structures. Morrison interjected, Admiral, what would you recommend for Lieutenant Commander Harrison's professional development? I'd recommend he spend some time in a joint command environment where he'll work regularly with civilian contractors, other service branches, and international partners. The experience of not being the ranking authority figure will help him develop more collaborative leadership skills. It wasn't a punishment, but it wasn't exactly a promotion track either. Harrison seemed to understand the implications. Thank you for the honest assessment, Admiral, he said. I'll work to address these issues. As the meeting concluded, Sarah realized how much had changed in the span of a single conversation. The carefully constructed scenario she had maintained for weeks was completely transformed. But perhaps that was inevitable. Walking back to her desk in the Supply Coordination Department, she reflected on the complexity of leadership and evaluation. The assessment had revealed exactly what it was designed to find, the real strengths and weaknesses of the command, unfiltered by the artificial dynamics of formal inspections. But it had also revealed something about herself. Being underestimated had become such a familiar experience that she had learned to use it strategically. The question now was whether that approach truly served the Navy's interests, or whether it simply protected her from having to prove herself over and over again. Chief Rodriguez approached her desk as she was packing up her notes for the day. Admiral, ma'am, he said, still clearly struggling with the title change. I just wanted to say that it's been an honor working with you, regardless of rank. You've made real improvements to how we do business, and you treated everyone with respect throughout the process. Thank you, Chief. That means more to me than you know." As she drove off the base that evening, Sarah thought about the phone call she would need to make to Admiral Hawkins. The assessment had been successful in many ways, but the compromise of her cover would require adjustments to future similar missions. The sun was setting over the Chesapeake Bay again, painting the same orange and purple sky she had seen on her first day. But everything else had changed. Tomorrow, she would return to the base not as Sarah Chen, civilian contractor, but as Rear Admiral Chen, conducting an official evaluation. The transformation was complete, and the real work of implementing change could begin, but she would miss the simplicity of being underestimated. There had been a certain freedom in being invisible, in being able to observe and analyze without the weight of stars on her shoulders. As she pulled into her hotel parking lot, Sarah smiled to herself. Lieutenant Commander Harrison would certainly have a story to tell his wife over dinner tonight, and Chief Rodriguez would probably spend the evening trying to explain to his team how their mild-mannered civilian coordinator had turned out to be a flag officer. But the most important outcome was that Norfolk Naval Base would be better prepared for the challenges ahead. The assessment had identified real strengths to build upon and real problems to address. The personnel were capable and dedicated, even if some needed development in certain areas. In the end, that was what mattered most, not the games of identity and authority, but the mission itself. Sarah had never forgotten that beneath all the politics and procedures, the Navy existed to protect and serve. Everything else was just details. The next morning, she would return to the base as an admiral. But she would carry with her the insights gained from 3 weeks of being overlooked, underestimated, and occasionally dismissed. Those insights would make her a better leader and the Navy a stronger organization. Sometimes the most valuable perspective came from the bottom up, and sometimes the best leaders were those who remembered what it felt like to be invisible.